The cowboy claimed a bride no one wanted. Then she transformed his harsh frontier life forever. The journey to Silas Boone's ranch took many hours. The road was long and quiet. Dust rose behind the wagon as the horses moved at a steady pace. Eliza sat beside Silas, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes watching the wide land around them. There were no crowded streets here, no gossiping voices, no narrow looks, only open sky, only wind, only silence. It felt strange, but not in a bad way. As the sun began to lower, Silas finally slowed the horses. "We're close," he said. It was the first thing he had said in a long time. Eliza nodded softly. She didn't ask questions. She simply waited. After a few more minutes, the ranch came into view. It stood alone. A small wooden house, worn by time. A fence that leaned in places. Dry land stretched around it, with only a few patches of grass trying to survive. It was not beautiful. It was not lively. It looked tired. Silas stopped the wagon. "This is it," he said again, his voice calm but quiet. Eliza looked at the house carefully. For a moment, she said nothing. Most people would have felt disappointment, but Eliza did not. Instead, she stepped down from the wagon slowly, her feet touching the dry ground. The wind brushed against her dress as she looked around. She saw broken things, but she also saw what they could become. Silas watched her, unsure of what she would say. "This is where we live?" she asked gently. He nodded. "It's not much." Eliza looked at him, then back at the house. "It's enough," she replied softly. Those words stayed with Silas longer than he expected. The first day passed quietly. Silas showed her the basics, the small kitchen, the storage room, the well outside. He did not explain much. He was not used to explaining things. Eliza listened carefully, remembering everything. Inside the house, dust covered nearly every surface. The table was rough. The windows were dull. The air felt heavy, like no one had truly lived there for a long time. That night, Silas ate quickly and stepped outside after finishing. Eliza stayed inside. She looked around the room slowly. Then, without saying anything, she began to work. The next morning, Silas woke early, as he always did. He stepped outside to begin his work, not expecting anything to be different. But when he returned later that day, something felt unusual. The door was open. Sunlight filled the room. He stepped inside and stopped. The floor had been swept. The table was clean. The windows were open, and fresh air moved through the house. Eliza stood near the corner, folding a piece of cloth she had found. She looked up when he entered. "I cleaned a little," she said quietly. Silas looked around again. A little? To him, it felt like a lot. He nodded once. "It's good." That was all he said, but it meant more than he showed. Days passed. Silas worked outside from morning until evening, fixing fences, checking the animals, trying to bring life back to the dry land. Eliza worked inside. She cleaned every corner of the house. She washed old dishes. She repaired torn fabric. She even found small ways to make the place feel warmer, moving things, opening space, letting light come in. She didn't rush. She didn't complain. She simply kept going. One afternoon, she stepped outside and looked at the yard. The fence was broken in places. The ground was uneven. But again, she did not see only problems. She saw possibilities. The next day, she started small. She gathered loose wood and placed it neatly. She cleared stones from the ground near the house. She even planted a few seeds she had brought with her, pressing them gently into the soil. Silas noticed. At first, he didn't say anything, but he watched. He saw how she moved carefully, how she didn't waste anything, how she treated even the smallest task with care. It was different. Very different. One evening, as the sun began to set, Silas walked toward the house. He expected the same quiet darkness inside, but when he opened the door, he paused. A soft light filled the room. A lantern sat on the table, and there, for the first time, was something new. Food. Simple, warm, and ready. Eliza stood near the stove, her hands slightly nervous. "I tried to make supper," she said. Silas looked at the table, then at her, then back at the table. Slowly, he stepped inside and sat down. He took a bite. It was simple, but it was warm. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like someone had been waiting for him. He didn't say much, but after a moment, he looked at her and said quietly, "Thank you." Eliza gave a small nod. Outside, the wind still moved across the dry land. The ranch was still far from perfect. But inside that small house, something had begun to change, and neither of them fully understood it yet. But they could both feel it. The silence was no longer empty. It was slowly becoming something else. The town of Dry Hollow was small, quiet, and full of opinions. People there noticed everything. They remembered every mistake, every rumor, and every small difference. And once they made up their minds about someone, it was almost impossible to change it. Eliza Turner knew this better than anyone. She had lived in Dry Hollow all her life, yet she never truly felt like she belonged. She was not loud or rude. She did not argue or complain. She simply kept to herself, helping where she could and speaking only when needed. But that was not enough for the people of Dry Hollow. They called her strange. Some said she was too quiet. Others said she had no spirit. A few even claimed she brought bad luck, though no one could ever explain why. Eliza never argued with them. She had learned long ago that words would not change their minds. So she stayed silent. One warm afternoon, the town gathered near the old church. A traveling preacher had arrived with news. Several men from distant lands were looking for wives, honest women willing to build a life far from town. It was unusual, but also exciting. Many young women stood in neat rows, dressed in their best clothes, hoping to be chosen. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd, unsure why she had come. She did not expect anything. She never did. The preacher stood tall, holding a list of names. One by one, he called out matches. Smiles spread across faces. Families whispered happily. Some women even cried tears of joy. Then, after a short pause, the preacher spoke again. Eliza Turner. The crowd went silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then the whispers began. Her? Why would anyone choose her? That poor man. Eliza felt her chest tighten, but she did not step back. Slowly, she walked forward, her hands slightly shaking, but her face calm. At the other end of the space stood a man she had never seen before, Silas Boone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and quiet. Dust covered his boots, and his clothes showed signs of long travel. His face was serious, but not unkind. He looked at Eliza for a moment, not with doubt, not with judgment, just a steady, thoughtful gaze. That alone surprised her. Silas had not come to Dry Hollow for love. He was a rancher who lived far away, beyond the easy roads and busy towns. His land was dry and stubborn. His house was empty. For years he had worked alone, speaking only to his horses and the wind. At first, he thought that was enough. But slowly, the silence became too heavy. He needed help, not just on the land, but in life. When the preacher gave him Eliza's name, he heard the whispers around him. He saw the doubtful looks. But Silas did not listen to them. He had spent enough time alone to understand something important. People were not always what others said they were. So he stepped forward. "I'll take her," he said simply. The words shocked the crowd. Eliza looked up at him, surprised. He did not smile, but there was something calm in his voice, something steady, something that made her feel safe. That feeling was new. The ceremony was simple. The preacher spoke a few words, the town watched in silence. Some shook their heads, others whispered behind their hands. But Eliza did not look at them. She kept her eyes forward. By the time the sun began to set, she was no longer Eliza Turner. She was Eliza Boone, a woman leaving everything she had known behind. Early the next morning, Silas prepared the wagon. The horses were ready, and the road ahead stretched long and quiet. Eliza stood for a moment outside the small house she had lived in for years. No one came to say goodbye. No one waved. It should have hurt, and maybe, deep inside, it did. But she did not cry. Instead, she turned and walked toward the wagon. Silas helped her up without a word. Then he climbed in beside her and took the reins. The wagon moved forward, leaving Dry Hollow behind. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The land slowly changed as they traveled. The busy town faded into wide open spaces. The air felt different, cleaner, freer. Eliza held onto the side of the wagon, watching the horizon. She did not know what waited for her. She did not know what kind of life she was going to. But for the first time in many years, she felt something small and quiet inside her. Hope. Silas glanced at her once, then looked back at the road. He was not a man of many words, but he had made a choice, and something told him that choice might change everything. Part 3. The change no one expected. Days slowly turned into weeks. The ranch no longer looked as empty as it once did. The changes were small at first. A clean yard, a fixed fence, a brighter house. But over time, those small changes began to grow into something much bigger. Eliza worked quietly, just as she always had. Every morning she stepped outside and looked at the land as if it was something alive. She noticed where the soil was soft, where the wind was too strong, and where the sun stayed the longest. She learned quickly, and she never gave up. The seeds she had planted began to show tiny green leaves. It was not much, but it was enough to bring a little color to the dry ground. Eliza smiled when she saw them. It felt like hope. Silas noticed that too. At first, he didn't think those small plants would survive. The land had been too harsh for too long. But somehow, with care and patience, they began to grow. Just like everything else around the ranch. Silas found himself watching Eliza more often, not in a strange way, but in a thoughtful way. He noticed how she moved with calm purpose, how she didn't rush or complain, even when the work was hard. How she spoke kindly, even when there was no one else around to hear it. It was something he had never seen before. One evening, Silas returned from the fields earlier than usual. He saw Eliza near the old well, trying to pull up a bucket of water. The rope was worn, and the wheel made a rough sound as it turned. He walked closer. "That thing barely works," he said. Eliza looked at him and nodded. "I know," she said, "but I think it can." Silas frowned slightly. "It's been broken for years." Eliza placed the bucket down and wiped her hands. "Maybe no one tried long enough," she replied softly. Silas didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward and examined the well. The wood was weak, the rope was rough, but it wasn't completely useless. Together, without planning it, they started to fix it. Silas adjusted the wheel. Eliza held the rope steady. It took time. It took effort. But slowly, it worked. When the bucket finally came up filled with clean water, Eliza smiled again. This time, Silas did too. It was a small moment, but it felt important. From that day on, things began to feel different between them. They spoke more, not long conversations, just small ones, simple words, but each word mattered. One night, they sat outside the house, watching the sky turn orange and gold as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The air was calm. The land felt peaceful. Silas leaned back slightly, his hat resting low. "You work hard," he said. Eliza looked at him, a little surprised. "So do you," she replied. Silas shook his head slightly. "I've always worked hard," he said, "but it never felt like this before." Eliza tilted her head. "Like what?" Silas thought for a moment. "Like it means something." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Eliza looked out at the land, then back at him. "Maybe it always meant something," she said gently. "You just didn't have someone to share it with." Silas didn't respond right away, but her words stayed with him, deep inside. The ranch continued to improve. The fence stood stronger, the animals looked healthier, even the house felt warmer, filled with light and quiet comfort. And Silas, he began to change too. He laughed once. It was a small laugh, but it surprised both of them. Eliza smiled when she heard it. It was the first time she had seen that side of him. "You should do that more," she said. Silas looked at her confused. "Do what?" "Smile," she answered. He shook his head, but there was a faint hint of amusement in his eyes. "I wouldn't know how." Eliza gave a soft laugh. "It's easy." Silas didn't say anything, but later that night, as he sat alone for a moment, he found himself thinking about her words, and slowly, just slightly, he smiled. Out on the land, the wind still moved across the fields, but it didn't feel as harsh anymore. The ranch was no longer just a place to survive. It was becoming a place to live. And Eliza, the woman no one wanted, had become the reason everything was changing. Not with force, not with loud words, but with quiet strength, patience, and care. And Silas was beginning to understand something he had never known before. Some of the strongest changes in life happen in silence. Part 4. A Life Worth Keeping. The first rain came quietly. Dark clouds gathered slowly over the wide sky, and the wind carried a cool feeling across the land. Silas stood outside the house, looking up, unsure if it would pass like all the others before. For years, the rain had avoided this place, but this time, it stayed. Small drops began to fall, touching the dry ground. Then more followed. Soon, the soft sound of rain filled the air. Eliza stepped outside, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's raining," she said softly. Silas nodded, but he didn't move. He just watched. The land, once dry and tired, began to drink the water. The small plants near the house stood stronger, their green leaves shining under the rain. Eliza walked a few steps forward, letting the drops fall on her hands. "It feels different," she said. Silas looked at her. "It is different." And for the first time, he truly believed it. The rain continued for hours, not heavy, not harsh, just steady and calm. When it finally stopped, the air felt fresh and the land looked alive. The next morning, everything seemed brighter. The soil was darker, the plants stood taller, even the sky looked clearer. Silas walked through the fields slowly, noticing the changes. For years, he had worked hard just to keep things from falling apart. But now, things were growing, and he knew why. When he returned to the house, he found Eliza outside, checking the small garden she had planted weeks ago. "It worked," she said, smiling. Silas stepped closer. "Yes," he replied, "it did." But he wasn't just talking about the rain. Days passed, and the ranch became stronger with each one. The changes were no longer small, they were clear. The fence stood firm, the well worked smoothly, the garden grew with life, and the house felt like a home. One evening, Silas returned from his work and stopped at the door. He could hear something inside, a soft sound. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Eliza was humming, a quiet, gentle tune as she worked. Silas stood there for a second longer than usual. Then he stepped inside. Eliza looked up and smiled slightly. "You're back early," she said. Silas nodded. "I finished sooner today." He removed his hat and placed it on the table. Then he looked around the room. Everything felt warm, not just because of the fire, but because of her. He took a slow breath. "Eliza," he said. She turned to face him fully. "Yes?" Silas hesitated. He was not used to saying what he felt, but this time he tried. "When I came to Dry Hollow, I wasn't looking for much," he began. "Just someone to help, someone to make things easier." Eliza listened quietly. Silas continued. "But you didn't just help," he said. "You changed everything." Eliza's expression softened, but she didn't interrupt. Silas looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "This place, it's not the same anymore," he paused. "I'm not the same anymore." The room grew still. Eliza stepped a little closer. "You gave me a place," she said gently. "I just tried to care for it." Silas shook his head. "It's more than that." He looked at her with quiet honesty. "You made it worth keeping." Those words stayed in the air between them. Eliza felt something warm rise in her chest. For so long she had been seen as someone who did not belong anywhere. But here, she was needed, she was valued, and most of all, she was seen. The sun began to set outside, casting a soft, golden light through the windows. Silas stepped outside and looked over the land once more. Eliza joined him, standing beside him in comfortable silence. The ranch stretched before them, no longer empty or lifeless. It was full of quiet strength, full of care, full of hope. Silas glanced at Eliza. "You ever miss Dry Hollow?" he asked. Eliza thought for a moment. Then she shook her head gently. "No," she said, and she meant it, because everything she had needed, everything she had hoped for, was right here. Not in a crowded town filled with judgment, but in a quiet place where she had been given a chance. Silas nodded slowly. "Good," he said. They stood there as the sky turned darker, the stars beginning to appear one by one. The wind moved softly across the land, no longer harsh, no longer empty. It carried something new, a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. And in that quiet moment, both of them understood something simple yet powerful. Sometimes the people no one chooses turn out to be the ones who change everything. And sometimes a harsh, lonely life becomes something beautiful just by letting the right person in.